webinar series. I'm joining you from Brisbane, Meanjin. And today's webinar is Medicinal Cannabis, the Evidence. My name is Michelle Taylor. I'm one of the clinical educators here at Inside. And today we're joined by Dr. Ian Thong, a neuroscientist and pain medicine specialist from the Gold Coast University Hospital, and also by Anthony Hall, Senior Clinical Pharmacist at the Gold Coast Hospital Persistent Pain Service. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event takes place. Here, that's the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all those places that you are joining us from here today. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And also to pay that same respect to all of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here today. So without further ado, I know there's great interest in today's topic. So I will be handing over to our two presenters and joining you later on. Please put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring those and we will have some time at the end to respond to them.
So good morning, and thank you for joining me and the opportunity to speak to you on the current evidence for medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis was approved to be prescribed by and legalised by the Australian government in 2016. This graph shows the trend in TGA approvals between June 2018 and May 2019. And the current number of applications and approvals is about 3,000 per month. This is not unsimilar to the data we see overseas. The current and actual number of new approvals is not clear right at this moment. Some of the applications are renewals to continue on with medicinal cannabis. Either way, it is a significant number. Why are there so many? Because medicinal cannabis is being promoted as the new wonder drug and the answer to many health problems, and considered healthy because it's a herb. Let me start with a summary of the evidence in case you fall asleep or have to go off. In general terms, the evidence doesn't support medicinal cannabis for chronic non-cancer pain and many other conditions. Some would argue there is evidence for neuropathic pain, but this is weak to moderate. The evidence for cancer pain is even more unclear, again, weak to moderate. What we see is reported benefits for some of the other symptoms related to cancer. There is, however, moderate to strong evidence for certain conditions, and I will discuss them in a moment. This is not just an opinion. As you can see, this evidence has been analysed by research and medical bodies, government agencies, and they all in principle agree. The evidence for pain is limited, and there is insufficient evidence to recommend cannabis for chronic pain. They also agree more quality research is required. So let's talk about the positive evidence, and let me point out that these are predominantly not pain symptoms. Dravet syndrome is severe myoclonic epilepsy of infancy, and we've certainly seen the press around this. And it is refractory to usual epileptic medications. Davinsky and other studies showed reduced seizures and convulsive seizure frequency in children between 2 and 18 years. And 5% of the children in the trial were actually seizure-free. The quality of this research is strong, and as such, the government has PBS listed Epidiolex, which is a CBD THC product. Rice, in 2018, analysed 2 high-quality systematic reviews, and their evidence suggested medical cannabis reduced the symptoms of patient-reported spasticity in MS. However, their analysis did not find the same for other neurological conditions. Grimson is involved in a current Australian clinical trial, and they have just completed phase 2 of the study. They've shown that medicinal cannabis, which is CBD and THC together, as an adjuvant with other antiemetics, reduces chemotherapy, nausea, and vomiting. And this study, because of its positive outcomes, is proceeding to phase 3 trial. The Australian National Prescribing Services looked at the evidence as well. They found moderate to strong evidence supporting medicinal cannabis for HIV-related wasting, but weak to moderate evidence for certain pain conditions, and if anything, it might help in multiple sclerosis, Tourette's, and motor neuron disease. They also concluded the evidence for other pain conditions is limited and insufficient to support recommendations. In fact, one of my colleagues has just published a paper in the Medical Journal of Australia, and that showed, they said, based on their research work, that medicinal cannabis should not be prescribed for chronic back pain. What about medicinal cannabis to reduce opioid use? Based on animal studies, medicinal cannabis could be useful, reducing opiate requirements after operations and after surgery. Some say it could even replace opioids. Babalonis and Walsh in 2020 presented evidence from animal studies. They reported that THC reduced opiate requirements in acute pain. However, this didn't correlate with human studies where patients reported preference to THC, but opiates were better for analgesia. An important finding from the study was that THC increased opiate risk of abuse. Riemann et al. In 2017 was an observational study in the US. They interviewed a number of patients, and based on those interviews, they reported that patients felt that cannabis was more effective than opioids and preferred. However, it wasn't qualified with what exactly the patients meant by more effective and for what conditions. They might mean, when they say they preferred cannabis, it might be reference to relative perceived safety and social acceptability. Now, in our pain clinic, many of our patients report less anxiety, muscle relief, better sleep, but not less pain. Now, so what about medicinal cannabis for deprescribing opioids? The Tuber proposed medicinal cannabis as a way to reduce opioid use. The study did not show medicinal cannabis reduced opioid use. They did show a slower rate of increase of opioid overdose deaths. That is to say, it took longer to get to the same endpoint. And they did see that they found that in the US, this was more obvious in legalized states. In Australia, Campbell, this is again a member of the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, completed a comprehensive review of the literature and could not find evidence that cannabis was useful for tapering or stopping opioids. In this pain clinic, we did not see a link between medicinal cannabis and opioid reduction. What we do see is patients reduce opioid doses with education and support from the multidisciplinary pain management team. Let me put my addiction hat on just for a moment. As I consult, I always ask the question, is the patient substituting one drug for another? This is common amongst clients with substance dependence. They often tell me how well they are going. They will say, I have stopped using cocaine. However, on further questioning, they've often started another drug or increased the use of a current one. So physicians live by the motto, do no harm. So with the specific conditions just described, if there is so little evidence supporting medicinal cannabis, are we actually causing harm supporting its use? Let's talk about this possible harm. Tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal and abstinence is well documented. Chronic users develop tolerance to THC and require more for the same effect. And they also report withdrawal symptoms when they stop using it. It is not uncommon to see clients progress from one drug to another. Recreational cannabis is often the first drug on a perilous journey to other drugs. We know about psychosis in new users, and cognitive impairment is commonly seen in chronic users, And it may be subtle at times, but it's often there. Then there's the obvious harm of smoking cannabis as smoking and smoking-related diseases. The developing brain is important in terms of drug exposure, and the developing brain is sensitive to drugs, and studies report cannabis harmful to the developing brain. Power in 2020 performed a systematic review and meta-analysis of longitudinal data of youths using cannabis regularly, and they found a reduction in IQ. In a Swedish study back in 1989 of 45,000 male military compulsory conscripts, it was found that higher chronic cannabis use was an independent risk factor for schizophrenia. So let's put this in the context of a real case scenario. This is an 18-year-old woman with chronic neck pain seen at the pain clinic. The history includes breast reduction surgery for back pain, Botox for migraines, excessive use of over-the-counter anti-inflammatories and paracetamol, overuse of codeine, using father's medication, which was 45 milligrams of oral morphine equivalent, and she'd already obtained CBD cannabis when she was 17, again for the neck pain, and had already made the decision at the last consult that she was going to start CBD THC product. When I examined her, all I found was muscular pain, nothing else. She was asked to take less medications, and the reply was, if I shouldn't take Nurofen and Panadol, should I take more codeine? This is an evolving substance dependence disorder, and the prescribed cannabis is adding to the problem. So, medicinal cannabis. Many say cannabis is good for easing anxiety, promoting relaxation, reducing muscle tension, sedation, and sleep. But what else could you use? What about meditation? Same effect, cheaper, a lot less harm. So humans are funny beasts. And Mark Guston said, human beings invent just as many ways to sabotage their lives as to improve them. And we see that in medicine all the time. If there is so little evidence supporting general use of medicinal cannabis and potential harm, what are we doing to make it making it easily available? And another big question is, should we actually support over-the-counter CBD? Anyway, let me finish with this. It is legal to prescribe medicinal cannabis in Australia. There are only a few conditions where it has proven benefit, yet it's been prescribed for many different conditions despite the lack of evidence. Human beings are human beings and always looking for the Holy Grail. But is it really cannabis? We all know that good quality research is required to change the situation in this space. I'll put this question to you. If you know a patient, client, or friend using it, have they been provided with all the information? Have they properly weighed up the risk and benefit? Are we making it too easily available and actually causing harm? Thank you. I will now hand you over to my pharmacist colleague.
Good morning. I can't see you, but never mind. I've been asked to talk about medicinal cannabis itself, and so I thought let's do a general title of cannabis and persistent pain. So first of all, what is cannabis? Well, cannabis is a product from the leaf and flowering parts of 3 species of cannabis: Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. Here's a nice picture of the cannabis plant. You can usually see just on the very center of the plant is the flower, and you can see that that's a sort of hairy area. And cannabis is otherwise known as marijuana. It's also known as hemp. It's called pot, and it's called weed, and there's lots of other different names. Within the cannabis plant itself, there are between 70 and 100 now pharmacologically active compounds have been identified, plus another 400 compounds which are related just to herbal substances. The most important ones of those which we need to be aware about are that it contains delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. It contains cannabidiol, or CBD. It also contains other ones like cannabinol and tetrahydrocannabivirin, THCV, and there's also cannabigerine as well. So lots and lots of different chemicals. Each of them is known to have some pharmacological activity, and that adds to the complexity of what we're talking about. The picture in front of you is actually of cannabis sativa. Cannabis indica has got longer, thinner leaves, and cannabis ruderalis has got red colored leaves. So pharmacologically, within our brain, we have been able to identify two areas on the surface of cells which interact with the natural ligands, as we call them, endogenous ligands, which are cannabis, which are called endocannabinoids. And we have two of them in the human body. We have a substance called anandamide, and we also have 2-arachidiol glycerol, or 2-AG, as it's called in shortened terms. Both of these are derived from fatty acids, and it's derived initially from lecithin. And lecithin, if you think about it, is the material that is composed of the cell wall within the body. So we have, similar to opioids, where we have endorphins and enkephalin, in the body we have two chemicals that work on receptors in the brain, which have been identified as also being associated with cannabinoids. These are CB1 and CB2. The CB1 receptors are found widely within the brain, in the hippocampus, in the cortex, in the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, in the spinal cord, in particularly in the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal cord, and are also found now in peripheral nerves, including presynaptic and sympathetic nerves. They seem to be absent from the thalamus and the brain stem, however. So that would suggest the brain stem is the most primitive part of the brain. So it may be something we have acquired as we developed as human beings. CB2 receptors are found mainly in the periphery, and they're found mainly associated with lymphatic tissue, which is, that means it's part of the immune system. And there are also low concentrations of CB2 receptors found in some of the brain regions, including something called the periaqueductal gray, which is a primary center for descending pain modulation. So, and they're also found on the glial cells in the spinal cord. The glial cells form the material, if you like, in which the nerves within the spinal cord are distributed. That, in other words, glial cells form the bulk of the spinal cord, and they are responsible for the immune modulation of spinal cord tissue. So these things seem to be associated with the immune system in particular. So here's where they're found. So they're found quite widely within the brain. This is just the CB1 receptors, found widely within the brain. And what I've tried to do here is that they have multiple, or they have the capacity to interact in multiple ways within the nervous tissue. So they can be used, for instance, they can have a role in reward, in other words, for addiction, which are usually dopaminergic in nature, but cannabidiol associated with them. They have a role in motor coordination and control. They have an activity in terms of memory and learning. And that's when one of the major problems we have within the immature brain, because if we're smoking heavily during childhood, this can inhibit the memory and the learning capacity. So many of these children often do less well at school, and they're spending more time smoking dope at home than going to school. They also have a role in body temperature, in feeding and neuroendocrine function, in anxiety and stress management, in the regulations of voluntary movements and movement in other areas, in also types of learning, as well as the decision-making, cognition, and emotional behavior of the human brain. So wide activity within the brain. The receptors themselves are activated through what we call G-coupled proteins. In other words, the medicine sits on the surface of the cell. The G-membrane proteins can produce responses within the cell, producing the pharmacological effects. And they produce physiological responses, including feelings of well-being, euphoria, psychosis, but also can impair memory and cognitive processing. It slows motor function, plus has potentially some anti-nociceptive activity, but also has some antiemetic, some antispasticity, and also some sleep promoting effects, depending upon the dose of THC that is being delivered. It's interesting to think now that paracetamol, we've been wondering how paracetamol works as an analgesic and also as an antipyretic. And it's thought that one of the metabolic breakdown products produced by the liver happens to mimic the effects of anandamide on CB1 receptors. So is this breakdown product, which is a potential vanilloid cation channel, what we call TRPV1 receptor agonist, is it actually working as an analgesic and as an antipyretic through similar effects to anandamide? And we talked about anandamide being responsible for instance, temperature regulation and potentially for other effects within the brain. Shahid did a study, a big study in 2021, and most of you would have seen the outcomes of that study on the news in recent, in the last month, where the research suggests that the analgesic effects of paracetamol are possibly only perhaps at most about 20% of reduction in pain. And that's probably similar to the effect we might also expect to see with placebo. So any effects of, I would suggest that any effects of cannabinoids in terms of pain are likely to be what we call a small effect size. They're not going to be massive reductions in the pain level, possibly only about 10 to 20% reduction. What are they used for? Well, hemp is probably the biggest product. Cannabis I find fascinating because cannabis is what we call a dioecious plant. It exists in both male and female forms. The male form does not produce flowers, obviously, because it's a male, and therefore it has very, very, very low levels of THC within the male form. And cannabis species of hemp are being grown commercially, both in Tasmania and here in Queensland. We have lots of growers of hemp commercially in Queensland, and that hemp is being grown mainly for its fiber content. And that fiber content is being used in paper, in the production of rope, hemp ropes, in the production of textiles, and it's also now incorporated into building materials. It's interesting, my cousin has actually built a house just at the top of the mountain, just behind Sydney, and she's built it out of bricks which are made of hemp. Marijuana is the name given to describe the female plant. And the female plant is grown mainly because it contains THC. We can see the growth of the female plants. You see it on the television again when the various sort of growing labs are being raided by the police. And as you'll see from the video of those seizures in the television, you'll see that they require big sources of light. They need a very high level of THC, and they also generally grown in small confined areas, so they get a very high level of humidity, and that increases the THC content of the cannabis being grown. So the use of, for instance, hydroponic growing is how they're trying to grow these things to really for the THC content. And marijuana is the most widely used recreational drug in the whole world. They have been used traditionally for medicine. There's use of cannabis for medicine traces back around about 2,700 years to China, and there are reports in some of the tablets from Sumeria, which is even earlier than that, of cannabis being used there, what they call the milk of the cannabis is being used. And it is a mixture of the plant in a cow's milk or in butter, because you use the butter or the cow's milk as the carrier, so that you get the drug dissolved into the fat content of the milk, and that's the way we absorb it. It was used generally in medicine. If you go and look at, for instance, the Royal Flying Doctor Museum in Alice Springs, you'll see bottles which are labeled cannabis used in medicine, and that carried on in medicine until about the 1930s. And in the 1930s, the United Nations, or the League of Nations as it was then, began to get some controls put into place on how drugs of potential misuse, like drugs like opium, should be produced, controlled within countries, and traded between countries. And this is when cannabis was rescheduled as a Schedule 9 medicine. In other words, it was an illicit drug and couldn't be used in medicine anymore. Cannabis, the cannabis varieties, the sativa, the indica, and the ruderalis, all contain different levels of THC. And so the growing conditions and the species is the important thing. The ratio between THC and CBD is important, as cannabidiol appears to attenuate the opposite effects of THC. So whereas the use of high levels of THC can cause anxiety, CBD seems to reduce that. To most people using cannabis recreationally smoke it, and on heating, if you heat the cannabis to more than 100 degrees for 90 mils, or if you burn cannabis, which is how we smoke it, obviously, this converts other cannabinoids into THC. So THC and CBD are really, I find them fascinating, because they are essentially the same chemical in terms of their constitution. It's the structure in which they're put together varies. And there is a degree of relationship between THC and CBD, so that when you heat CBD, you convert it to THC. So this is why when individuals smoke cannabis, they try to produce a very, very hot, burning flame, if you like, within the cannabis, which is why we see then the use of processes to cool the smoke down so it can be inhaled, hence the use of, for instance, hubble bubble and bongs. It just reduces the temperature of the smoke. CBD seems to control THC metabolism by its effects on cytochrome P450, and I'll talk more about P450 in a minute. The psychoactive effects of cannabis are biphasic, so we get initial primary relaxation and euphoria, and this is what most people use it for. You then get some secondary psychoactive effects, such as the facility for what are described as philosophical thinking, introspection, and metacognition, all then followed by by reports of anxiety and paranoia. And this is all a dose effect. So when most people start to smoke cannabis, you don't use the cannabis very effectively. And so all you're going to see are the first effects of relaxation and euphoria. It's only when people become experienced in smoking cannabis and smoke more, are they going to get the risks of these other psychoactive effects? And large enough doses can produce both auditory and visual hallucinations. If you look at this, which is comparing, if you like, the dependence potential and the toxicity of these drugs as single active dose, you'll see that in the top right there, you've got heroin, very, very high dependence potential. And also, it's not that toxic. So it is highly toxic. The next one down you'll see is alcohol, that has moderate dependency, but again, quite high toxicity. Then you got morphine, cocaine, NDMA as another level of toxicity. Nicotine is their really potent dependence potential, which is why people find it so hard to stop smoking. And then you got pentobarbital, rohypnol, for instance, and ketamine. Marijuana is right down here on the left-hand side of the graphs, only a moderate low risk of dependence and also a very, very low toxicity. So it is, from all effects that we can see, it has very little toxicity. In fact, as far as we can tell, there have been few deaths associated with the use of marijuana. But there are some are recorded, usually by misadventure as a consequence after smoking. As Ian recorded, there is an increased risk of developing schizophrenia noted in younger patients who are using large doses of cannabis. This is sort of around about your 18 years and younger. There are some potential risks of reduced fertility or increased early miscarriage, but we don't know whether that might be the effect of smoking. It's been seen in recreational use, but not in medicinal use, and we think it's probably the effect of smoking. In California, about 5% of women were taking recreational cannabis during pregnancy, especially, they were saying, for morning sickness, and that seems to be increasing. So we're likely to see increased use of cannabis being used during pregnancy. It is excreted in breast milk, and that can occur for up to 6 days after the use of it. So what we're trying to go and explain is that, yes, it's not so much, it's not harming you, it's not harming your baby, but it's the long-term effects is that this going to, you're going to get it excreted in breast milk. And do you want your baby to go and get that drug? The risks to infants are not known, but it isn't considered to be safe. There are some side effects usually associated with anxiety, depression, and then the effects of paranoia. We've got a cannabis discontinuation syndrome, which is truly an addiction withdrawal effect. But there's also this thing called cannabis-induced hyperemesis syndrome, where long-term users of inhaled cannabis experience repeated and severe bouts of vomiting. And that is often, as I said, long-term regular use. They also have, you also find many of them have, to get over the vomiting, they take very hot baths. They find that by increasing their body temperature, it relieves the symptoms. So these are patients that you might see within the emergency department. I'm not going to talk so much about synthetic cannabinoids. I wanted just to ignore that. Medical marijuana now legalized in many states in the US. There were moves to introduce it into Australia. There was a big poll, a poll conducted by the Morgan Group, looking at what did the public population of Australia think about the medical use of marijuana. We can see here that Campbell Newman was open-minded about it. The New South Wales government thought they would support some clinical trials for its use. The Victorian Premier came up with the same. Tony Abbott said, because he was PM at the time, that he had no problems with the medical use of cannabis. And Mike Baird announced to the New South Wales government that he was going to fund 3 studies for use in children with severe epilepsy, for use in palliative care, and also for cancer-induced nausea or chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. 2016, we had a amendments made to the Narcotics Act, which passed the way to legalizing medicinal cannabis. This is a change in the way that the federal government interacted with that international law and the UN. Each state then had its own regulations on how medicinal cannabis could be accessed. And in Queensland, this was controlled initially through the MRQ, the Medicines Regulation Unit in Queensland Health. And there are 3 types of prescriber authorized. You can get an authorized specialist. So for instance, a neurologist who's specializing in the treatment of multiple sclerosis can become an authorized prescriber for cannabis, but only for that condition. We can have any medical prescriber, any doctor can prescribe medicinal cannabis, but they can only, but there's only for that individual patient, and the drugs are then obtained through the SAS or Special Access Scheme. And also doctors can become authorized as prescribing within the clinical trial. Now, medicinal cannabis is not the same as recreational cannabis. To begin with, we have said, right, medicinal cannabis should not be smoked in the way that we do regular or recreational cannabis. We as healthcare professionals cannot support the use of smoking as a delivery process. So if you see someone comes in and they want to smoke their cannabis, they come in with a bag of flowers and they want to smoke that cannabis for a medical purpose, that is not medicinal cannabis. The problem with cannabis is what we call a promiscuous plant. In other words, it takes into the plant everything that is in its surroundings. So if you expose the plant to the heavy metal, for instance, found within soil within Australia, that heavy metal comes into the plant and contaminates the plant. If you're going to expose that plant to an insecticide to make sure that you don't have bugs growing on the plant, you're going to get that insecticide within the cannabis. So medicinal cannabis has got to be free of chemical and heavy metal contamination. It also has to be free of the fungal contamination, because if you can think about the growing advantages, the temperature and the humidity, that makes that this is a very nice growth media for various fungi. So the product has got to be free of those and must be tested for that before it can be used as a medicine. It's got to be produced under what we call GMP or Good Manufacturing Practice standards. It's the same sort of standards that are applied to any medicine used within our practices in healthcare. So it has to be the same degree of quality as, for instance, a paracetamol tablet that you might buy over the counter, or a dose of quetiapine that you're giving to your patient with schizophrenia. It's got to be the same type of quality, and that's done under the GMP requirements. In 2016, in Queensland, a decision was made to amend the Narcotics Act, which is part of the drugs and poisons regulations, to permit the medicinal use of cannabis. THC, any product containing THC, is scheduled as S8, a controlled drug, whereas CBD only products are scheduled S4 or prescription only medicines. In February this year, CBD was down-regulated to an S3 product. That's a pharmacy-only medicine, as long as it's available in a daily dose of 150 milligrams or less. The CBD content has got to comprise at least 98% of the total content, and the THC content must be 1% or less. So you cannot get high doses of THC with CBD over the counter. It must be packed in a blister or strip packaging or other child-resistant packaging in packs of not more than 30 days supply. And it's available over the counter only for adults of 18 years or older who have declared that they are not planning or be planning on becoming pregnant or breastfeeding. And all the products that are suitable for this have to meet what we call OST-L or Australian listed or Australian regulated products. So if you look at most of your over-the-counter complementary medicines, the most commonly used ones, like for instance, fish oil, will all be at OST-L or OST-R quality. This is a quality measurement similar to GMP. At the present time, there are no CBD products that meet these requirements, and therefore, if your patients go to a community pharmacy, there is no products that they have available that meet these requirements. Even though they're able to sell them, there's no products. That is not the problem of the government. This is a problem of the manufacturers. They have not done the work to meet OST-L or OST-R regulations. So that's why we don't have any of the products available. What we do have, medicinal cannabis, how's it taken? Well, we have oral formulations. The original ones was what we call Mulloway's cannabis tincture. It was an alcohol-based product, and you used to have to add that to water. So it's a cannabis extract. You can, of course, get your cannabis cookies. These are a baked product where you're using the butter, very high levels of butter in your cookie as a way of getting cannabis into the product. Again, no controls or standardization available. There are oil, or which we call drops. These are olive oil, coconut oil, sesame oil, MCT oil are being used commonly. These are oral drops. We've also got an oral mucosal spray. For instance, Sativex or Nabiximol, which is a pharmaceutical product, which has been available in Australia for nearly 10 years, but used only in the management of muscle spasm within multiple sclerosis, and was not available on the PBS, so it's still expensive. As I said, we don't support smoked cannabis. What we do support in the law is what we call vaped or vaporized products, where you're using a very low temperature, less than 100 degrees centigrade, which doesn't burn the product or decarboxylate the problem. So you're going to get the initial meds, chemicals involved in that product are what's available then inhaled. And we've also got coming through, we've got some dry powder inhalers similar to that used in the management of asthma. And then there are topical treatments. For instance, there are still creams and ointments available, and they're in the process of developing some transdermal patches of cannabinoids as well. We've had 3 cannabis products available worldwide, and I come from the UK, and I've used all 3 of those products, not personally, in my patients. There's a medicine called Nabilone, which is a synthetic THC product, trade name Sesamet, and that was introduced in around about the early 1980s for cancer-induced nausea and vomiting. Then there was a second product called Dronabinol or Marinol, which is another more potent form of THC, again used for the same indication. Both were widely available in the UK, but they were also very sedating. I was working in oncology in that time, and I used to often suggest to patients that if they couldn't afford Nabilone or Dronabinol, that smoking something before they came to the clinic might be helpful in reducing their nausea and vomiting. It was a major problem because we really didn't have anything that was effective. Then towards the end of the 1980s, we had a new drug was released on the market called ondansetron. Now, most of you will be familiar with this, Zofran. It was marketed by Glaxo as an antiemetic for cancer-induced nausea and vomiting. It wasn't so effective against nausea, but it was probably the most effective medicine I have ever seen for controlling cancer-induced vomiting. Suddenly, almost overnight, vomiting related to chemotherapy was really a situation of the past. And with that, we stopped using any of the cannabinoids for this particular purpose. We've also now got a wide range of imported pharmaceutical medicinal cannabis products. Most of them are coming, they're imported from Canada and from Europe, where they've been widely available. And these are products made by, for instance, Tilray and MedRelief and Canopy in Canada, and Bedrocan, which is a product coming from Holland in Europe. We now have more products being produced in Australia. There is a cannabis producing farm in the western suburbs in Brisbane. There is another farm which is located behind the Sunshine Coast, and there's a couple more farms in other parts of Queensland. We've actually got a company that processes the plants and produces the medications, which is based here on the Gold Coast, out at Southport. So these are products that are being developed, but they're not widely available because of the problems with cannabis or medicinal cannabis. Sativex is the one that's been around longest. That's nabiximol, manufactured by GW Pharmaceuticals, registered, as I said, several years ago, 2013, it was registered by the TGA in Australia. It's a spray that contains both THC and CBD. These are both being produced out of what we call genetically modified strains. So you're taking a specific strain of your cannabis sativa, you're growing the female plants and then modified genetically to produce just THC. And then there's another strain which is just producing CBD. This product has been available for a long time. It never got PBS endorsement. It's licensed only for MS-related spasticity, and it was too expensive for most individuals to be able to use. I was involved in running a clinical trial when I worked in Leeds. We were using oral dronabinol at the time, so I was using a THC product for use in central pain. And we used an N of 1 research methodology. So we had individual patients and we gave them the medication, the active medication for 1 week, and then we swapped it to a placebo for a week. In this case, we used vitamin E capsules as the placebo, and we alternated between that for 8 cycles, which is important within the methodology. We had 36 patients identified, but we were only able to enter 9 patients onto our study, despite this being a university hospital which had twice the beds of Gold Coast. We were only able to find 36 patients that met our criteria for admission. 50% of those patients were elderly patients after having had a stroke, which is the cause of their central pain. The other 50% were younger patients with multiple sclerosis. We then did the study. At the end, we got them to manage their pain with weekly pain diaries, and we looked at changes and then looked at a patient global impression of change at the end of the study. There was no change in pain scores at any point in any of the groups in our study. But in the patient global impression of change, the older population of patients did not like dronabinol at all. They hated it, didn't want to take it. They didn't like the way it made them feel, the psychotropic effects, and they didn't like the way it made them, that stimulated their appetite, what we used to call with recreational cannabis, the munchies. The MS patients, on the other hand, are younger patients, universally liked dronabinol and wished to continue. But they told us it wasn't for pain relief, but for relief of a condition which I wasn't aware of at the time in MS, which is a pain related to bladder spasm, that intense discomfort within the lower abdomen associated with the desire to empty the bladder, but perhaps not being able to for various reasons, social reasons. For the MS patients, it produced this bladder spasm. So you got that really intense discomfort. Obviously, it was a negative study. It wasn't able to show any benefit, so it wasn't accepted for publication, but we did get it presented at the British Pain Society meeting, and it's there in publication now, only as a paper presented at that meeting. So the conclusion I want to say is that there's still no evidence of benefit, no conclusive evidence of benefit with medicinal cannabis, but there's also but we should need to be aware that no evidence of benefit does not equate to no evidence of benefit. So the fact that we can find no evidence doesn't mean that there is no benefit seen in some individuals. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we have. You get lots of positive response, but they're all N of one. They're all individual experiences which are being promoted. But from our experience in the clinic, we're seeing lots of patients, it doesn't help. Still requires, as Ian said, it still requires a very carefully constructed treatment plan and a follow-up strategy. You need to make sure that there's an ability as a default to how to get out from using it if you need to. You need to monitor the use and the dosage, and also to think about how can we prevent this product being diverted. So if you've got a THC-rich product, how does that mean it's going into the patient and not being sold on the streets? We also need to evaluate its dependence risk. So it's almost like an opioid replacement study we need to thinking of. Very, very quickly, we've got one breaking story in that we now have a product called Epidiolex, which has become just available on the PBS. This is a CBD-only product made by GW, and it's now on the PBS for the treatment of a very rare myoclonic epilepsy in infancy called Dravet's syndrome. It's very, very rare, but it is a really poorly controlled epilepsy in children. I've seen photos, stories on the news of kids who are having 50, 60 epileptic seizures a day, and the claim from mum is that when I started using cannabis on my child, their epilepsy ceased. Now, this is a trial that was then conducted using CBD for the treatment of epilepsy, and it does appear to be very effective. And Ian referred to the Dravinsky study, which showed that there were some patients who stopped having seizures completely, but most patients had a reduction. At that stage, I'm going to stop and we'll open it up for any questions.
Yes, thank you.
Jim Finn here, just wondering if any idea of any timeline where the pharmacy-only CBD might be available?
The current estimate is there are no products being submitted to the TGA for registration. Registration takes a while to achieve, so it's going to be probably the end of 2022 rather, or perhaps mid-2023. It's a question that's similar to when is international flights going to restart up. We just don't know. It's a guess.
Thank you. I've got another question from the room. Any evidence of how long-term use affects the immune system, and what that means for people undergoing chemotherapy?
No evidence. I know of anecdotes. I've got a friend who had a testicular cancer, who has been taking CBD religiously since before his diagnosis, or when he was first diagnosed, to now. He's doing incredibly well, but he has had one recurrence and he's had treatment for that. So whether it's doing anything, we just don't know. But because it's CBD, it's unlikely to do any harm. But whether it does any good is unknown.
Thank you. Another question from the room.
Is there any evidence? We know that cannabis, straight cannabis use can cause anxiety, especially longer term use. Is there any evidence just around CBD in itself isolated for reducing anxiety?
There are anecdotal reports, but nothing of any clinical significant or clinically proven studies yet. Most of the studies are poorly controlled. It's very difficult to control, to provide a good placebo for cannabis, particularly THC containing cannabis. Most individuals know when they're taking THC. So to provide a placebo to do a comparative study is very difficult. They're also, most of the studies are very small, mainly because just how difficult it was to get a decent product. And that's, I think, is the biggest problem, is that most of the studies are referred to recreational sources, which honestly, we just don't know what's in them.
Can I add to that, that when you talk to our psychologists, they say, but the patients really like it because they feel better, but it's not quantified in terms of, is that anxiety or other things? So they don't want to give it up, but you can't say it's definitely for anxiety. They just feel relaxed and better.
Thank you. So from the chat questions, the notion of harms and risk-benefit analysis, this has come up a bit in the chat, around opioid replacement therapy, and the idea that, okay, it may be, or maybe it is slightly less effective, but is it safer? You know, with that therapy, we are replacing one substance with another. So there was interest around your responses to that.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. And so what I saw living in the bush, where unemployment was very high and recreational drug was very high, use was high, you knew a lot of the patients were using CBD or cannabis, not smoking cannabis, not using medicinal cannabis. There was also a strong use of other recreational drugs. There was always that concern when you assess patients that they were moving from cannabis as a teenager, where it was easy to access and everyone's handing it around, to moving to stronger drugs. Is it true a transition from one drug to another? It's unclear, but you've got to keep in mind that in the younger generation, they are invincible. They actually do lots of things thinking it is harmless. And they have that risk in those environments where illicit drugs are very available, of actually experimenting with other drugs. Alcohol was also heavily used in the bush because, again, boredom, probably more than anything else, and easily available. And that probably paints the same picture. So you can't say definitely cannabis leads to other drug use. Is it an indicator? Not specifically, but it's that behavior of, oh, well, this didn't do anything, maybe I could try something else, that you have to keep in mind when you're prescribing pretty well any drug with a risk of dependence.
Just another thing as well, from the rural environment, most of the cannabis that's being used in that environment is grown locally, and they're not using the same techniques that we're seeing, for instance, the bikie gangs or the illicit cannabis growers using within, for instance, the Gold Coast in the city environment. So the THC content of bush cannabis is much less than the skank that we're seeing being grown in the cities. And it is probably safer because of that. The more CBD content of that bush cannabis, the more antagonism you're getting between the CBD and the THC.
I think when you're doing assessments of patients and considering their use of cannabis, you're weighing up their risk of substance use disorder. So the opiate risk tools and stuff like that will paint a picture. They're not perfect, even though a validated tool, they're not perfect. And so it's about that, again, that's that clinical experience about recognizing when someone's drifting down that pathway. And it's nice to be able to, this particular patient that we saw, it's nice to be involved in the early phase as opposed to when I'm usually involved in the later phases when they've already got a polysubstance dependence.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that we are heading over time. This probably calls for another webinar, because there's been a great deal of interest. Do you have any future predictions given the decriminalisation, the ACT? That's another question, or range of questions from the panel. I might finish with that one. For over the counter, for use in the future, or are we asking you a question that's too difficult?
I think it's we've been exposed to a number of drugs that have been presented as useful in pain management in the last 10 years. And each time we've seen an issue. Pregabalin is the one that really stands out. It was promoted as the alternative opioids for back pain. And so it got overprescribed, and now we're dealing with an actual addiction crisis. Well, not crisis, but a problem. And so, but it's already been addressed in Australia, and doctors are now not prescribing it as much, recognizing that there is a dependence to that medication. And you certainly see in correctional services, every time I talk to someone, I say, oh, is 1,000 milligrams bad? In the correctional services and clients in those places, you can see up to 3,000 milligrams used for its effect. And that is a problem for something that they promoted as harmless, but it's definitely not. So while cannabis is probably a safer product, especially manufactured in the way we're starting to regulate it, you've got to keep that in mind for everyone at risk, which is not a huge percentage of the patients, but it's there. And we don't want this need to, oh, look, I just need something else to manage my pain. And it's not showing that it's that useful at this stage.